Step into the room. It's Rose Resource Room. Today's conversation is going to be a little bit different. If you've seen my interviews, I could go rapid fire Q&A and go back and forth with just questions. But today, we're not going surface level. We are discussing America's founding. And this episode, we're going to slow down and make way and room for our history, one that spans decades of grassroots activism, constitutional education, religious liberty, advocacy, and a deep conviction that America's founding principles still matter. Joining us today is Hal Shurtleff. He is the founder and director of CAM Constitution, an educational organization dedicated to teaching the U.S. Constitution, American history, and the nation's Judeo-Christian heritage. For years, Hal has been engaged in civic and political life, speaking, teaching, organizing, and encouraging Americans to better understand the principles upon which this country was founded. Many people may have heard his name before because he was involved in a legal battle that made its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court in Shurtleff versus City of Boston. He challenged the city's refusal to allow a Christian flag to be flown on a public flagpole that had previously been made available to numerous community groups. I'm not going to get into all the details, but you need to listen in as we talk about the First Amendment, free speech, and religious liberty. As we approach America's 250th anniversary, I wanted to go beyond headlines and court cases. I wanted to hear the story behind the man. What shaped his convictions? What lessons has he learned from decades of activism? What does he believe Americans misunderstand about their history? And what does he hope for the nation's future? So listen in, settle in, grab a book, grab a pen, grab a blanket, or grab a nice beverage and listen in as we hear stories after stories about faith, freedom, and America's founding. Tune in and leave us some messages in the comments to let us know what you thought about this episode. Welcome to another episode of Rose Resource Room. I'm your host, Ro, and today I'm here with a very special guest who has done so many amazing things, especially as it relates to preserving our liberty and our rights. Welcome to our show. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's an honor.
It's my pleasure. Can you just give us a quick um, history? So I'm sure your bio is extensive, but just tell us about who you are as a person, what excites you, and what you're working on these days.
You have an hour or more? No. Yeah. Well, I'm born and raised in Boston. We moved out of Boston up to New Hampshire a little more than 5 years ago. I worked on my dad's drugstore as a young boy, so I kind of got to not just know about running a business and the problems that go along with it, but also many of the customers were World War II veterans at the time, and they were everywhere back when I was a young man. So that's what really gave me a love of history when you actually could know people who participated in historical events, like my dad. I went through the forced busing in Boston, which was a really ugly chapter. And what I learned is that the heavy hand of government is one thing, is a very negative impact of a heavy hand of government, but also how government promotes things like race hatred. We lived in a probably a white community in Boston. We had black students in our in our schools. We got a lot. I can still name some of my elementary school black schoolmates. We were buddies, we were friends. Then we had the city, well, it was actually a federal government mandating, and we had all kinds of problems. We had communists starting riots. We had neo-Nazi. I mean, it was almost like they were working hand in hand. So that kind of gave me a unique perspective on how things work, or how they don't work in some examples. And I went in the Army and spent 3 years in the regular Army. I spent 2 years in a combat arms unit in West Germany, field artillery, almost 2 years, and about a year, a little less than a year in the 101st Airborne, and then some time in the Army Reserves. And but I always loved history. I always had a great love of the Constitution. I had an eighth grade teacher in a government school. There used to be some really good teachers back then. Her name was Mrs. Wolf, and she made us memorize the preamble of the Declaration, of the preamble of the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, the parts of the Declaration of Independence, not the whole thing, but a couple of the paragraphs. And we had to learn about the Constitution. We had to memorize dates and memorize things. So when I took my oath, I think I had just turned, that was 17 years of age. I had a pretty good understanding. I wasn't a walking law student when it comes to the Constitution, but I had a pretty good understanding of what I was taking an oath to. And I believe that oath stays with me till the day I die. It's just something you do, or just a formality. Oh, I have to do this in order to get in. Um, but I guess I could say, not so much a political activist, but more of a freedom activist for many, many years. I organized events, hosted speaking engagements. It was 2008. I was involved with a national camp program. It was a week-long camp program that was canceled. And well, before that, I want to get back to it. My homeschooling background. I was a good friend of the late Sam Blumenfeld. He was a pioneer in the homeschool movement. I think I sent you some of his
You
alpha
did.
phonics.
Thank you.
And I first met Sam, it was 1989. And before he even said hello or shook my hand, he said, "Do not let your children set foot in a government school." At that time, I had one child. Now I have five. And that was some of the best of, advice, with the exception of marrying my wife, accepting the Lord as my Savior. That was some really good advice, which I took. And I actually joked several, it was in 2010 or so. I said, "Sam, I have to break that promise." What do you mean? I said, "Well, two of my girls dance, and the dance recital is being held at the high school. So they are stepping foot in the government school. They're not just, but that's only for a temporary." So, well, that's different. You're off the hook, Hal. But so we don't regret doing it. It was a wonderful experience. It was difficult, especially back in the let's see, we started maybe in the late 90s. And it's interesting, we got more pushback from people in our own church than we did anywhere else. And we lived in Boston at the time. It's like we're behind enemy lines, but we didn't really have any difficulty. We did it. We had a good job. We did a really good job. It was tough. I used to travel a lot for my job, and I used to be able to, on occasions, take my children, one child, two children. And my philosophy was the whole country is a classroom. Just sitting, it's okay to, I mean, I'm a great lover of books and, classroom instruction. But I remember one time we had one of my girls was doing learning about Noah Webster. And I said, "Oh, let's go to his house. I'm going to be down in Connecticut next week, and you come down." And so we got a chance to tour the house, and a real hands-on, and not just in the book. And again, books are great, but it's nice to actually, see it's kind of living history, actually go there and see where he lived, where his wife was, what he did, and what have you. So that was so we took our children. I took them to pretty much all over the country, and we would visit state houses, museums. We went out to an event in Utah, and it was interesting. We went to the promontory point where the Golden Spike Railroad was done, and so I said, "Yeah, we can learn about that." But here it is. It's so that to me was a great experience. And no matter where you live in the country, you have lots of history if you look for it. Obviously, if you're in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, maybe it's a little easier than some of the other states that maybe didn't come into the country until later. But there's still so much history. It's amazing. And and culture, the arts and things, art museums,
Mhm.
science museums, and things like that. So, so anyway, it was 2009 when we started Camp Constitution. Initially, it was just a 1 week long family camp, but mission creep. Sometimes mission creep is a good thing, especially when it came to our camp. I had a friend ask me if I could find a book that dealt with the Federal Reserve Bank. It was called Farm Boy to Financier. He said if you could find that one chapter of this book that really, and it took me about 3 or 4 years, and I found it, and we put it in print. That became Camp Constitution Press. And so we don't have to do a lot, but we put stuff back in print. Basically some important things that have not been put in print for a while, or even not too well known. And we've published a few of our own titles. In fact, a couple of years ago, I wrote a book entitled "The Racist Roots of Planned Parenthood and Its Legacy of Death." So, so those and the week-long camp. I think our first camp we had 50, and it's a family camp. It includes, mom, dad, children, little children, babies, in-laws. etc. And we have unaccompanied adults as well as some unaccompanied children. I think we had 50 at our first camp, and the last camp we had in 2020 during the lockdown,
Mhm.
when everything was being canceled, they said, we're not canceling our camp. In New Hampshire, it was not as strict as some of the other New England states. And the folks that own the camp said, look, if you cancel, it's fine. You can get a full refund. But if you don't, we won't hold you to the contractual obligation. At that time was 75. I said, great. I said, if it's just my wife and I, we'll show up. Well, we had the biggest turnout we ever had in our camp history. We're the only game in town, it was great. And so I think last year we had about 135. And you don't want the camp to be too big because then you sort of don't get a chance to meet everybody and have that, relationships and all that. So I think it's just big enough, it meets our needs and people walk away with having a great time. We had one, and we always get these wonderful testimonials from people. We had this one family, two young boys, mom and dad, and I don't know what the mom was expecting, but she said this camp far exceeded my expectations, and I like to hear that. So, and we're very blessed. We have a really great lineup of instructors, and I get a chance to meet people during the course of the year, and I'm always looking at potential speakers. I'm looking at you, huh? You'd be a great speaker. It's like a talent. It's one of the hats I wear as talent scout. So I was at a homeschool show in Maine just this past weekend, and I think I found a couple of not just some great families to attend, but also some potential instructors. Oh, I've got some folks from TPUSA, the high school group. They have, and so they're going to be coming to camp this year. And we have people like Alex Newman, who is an author. He speaks about 6 or 7 languages. He travels around the world. He's an expert on education. In fact, he's sort of the heir to Sam Blumenfeld, when Sam passed away, unofficially the baton. It went to a lot of us, but he was one of them. And Pastor David Whitney, who's with the Institute on the Constitution, Mary Grabar, who is a historian. She wrote a book entitled Debunking Howard Zinn. I don't know if you're familiar with Howard Zinn and all the really evil influence that he had. He wrote a book called The People's History of the United States, which is almost a major history book in most government schools, and it's just riddled with lies and anti-Americanism. So she wrote a book, debunking a lot of most of what he had said in the book, which was not true. And let's see who else do we have. We have, in addition to, we have one of the world's top atmospheric scientists, Dr. Willie Soon, and Dr. Soon was one of the men that helped debunk what they call the hockey stick graph. So those of you who follow the subject, the hockey stick graph was supposed to say, oh, look at this, what a hockey stick obviously looks like, and it shows this big, this, and see, look, oh, the Earth's burning up. And Willie looked at that and he said, no, no, no. He said, we're talking about an incremental, and they left out the medieval warming period. So it would look more like a boomerang than it would a hockey stick. And that was in '04. So we got a lot of notoriety. And he's been a regular. He comes with his whole family. And Alex Newman comes up with his whole, they drive up from Florida up to New Hampshire.
Oh, wow.
And we videotape almost all of our classes and are on our YouTube channel. In fact, we had a homeschool mom say, "You have a good civics course for my." I said, "As a matter of fact, almost everything we have is civics." So I said, all to do is I'll create a playlist and put some of the stuff on there, that you can use. And so I said, "Gee, thanks for the idea. I should have done that before." Because when people say, do you have a program like a syllabus?" I said, "Well, not not a formal syllabus, but here are some things you can use. And we have some great downloads on our website, free downloads. And you can create your own program with this. So, yeah, so and we've been now, this will be our 18th, this July's camp will be our 18th. And we also started a ladies retreat program. It's the first weekend in May. Usually for older moms, but it's ladies, young ladies as well. But it's mostly some of the camp moms and some of their friends that been having a good weekend of fellowship and what have you. So,
Thank you so much for sharing. I actually want you to tell us about a case that involves a Christian flag
oh
being
yes,
flown in Boston and what happened, because I don't want to do a spoiler alert.
sure. Well, the city of Boston used to have a program where civic organizations or even individuals can file a permit to see if they have a flag raising ceremony. And they've been doing it since I think '08. It was interesting. I was in Boston. I was actually just dismissed from jury duty. And I walk across to the City Hall Plaza and I see the communist flag of China being raised. I says, what is going on here? And I discovered that it was a communist Chinese group, a local pro-communist group, the Chinese Progressive Society or Association, and they were celebrating the communist takeover of China. I said, here in Boston, it was known as the cradle of liberty, and I'm seeing this. So I used to work with other groups, and we would protest. And we protest, we do peaceful. We're not there trying to get anyone angry. You just let them know about the horrible crimes that were committed over the years by this horrible tyrannical government. It was in 15, I think, that we raised the Gadsden flag. We had a ceremony. The Gadsden flag is the yellow flag with the rattlesnake that says, "Don't tread on me." And one of our speakers was the late Patriot pastor. He was 6'7", and he wore what they call the Black Robe Regiment, which was worn by clergy at the time of the War for Independence. And he had his musket. You see, I have a musket behind me with the bayonet, but and he's walking through downtown Boston with his musket. It was beautiful, but it was in 17 that an inner city pastor, Bruce Wall, had invited me to participate in a prayer meeting in the mayor's office in Boston. Now, the mayor had nothing to do with it. That was Mayor Marty Walsh at the time. He had nowhere to be found. I went there and there were blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and we prayed. We prayed for the city, as the Bible says, we pray for our leaders. We don't have to necessarily like them, and we may dislike them very much, but the Bible says pray for them. We prayed for peace. We shared testimonies, sang hymns, and I left there thinking, the Christian community needs to step up here in Boston. And that's what I think motivated me. So I tried to get a permit to raise the Christian flag, and that flag is a white field, and the left is blue, and then the red cross. It's called the Latin cross, and the flag doesn't go back that far. Although there's been uh, different flags that have that red cross. This was created by a couple of Sunday school teachers, or a Sunday school teacher and a Sunday school superintendent of all places, Coney Island. So I tell people a couple of good things that come out of there. The Nathan's famous hot dog, and the Christian flag. But so, and our goal was to have a ceremony to promote the U. It was around Constitution Day, which is September 17th. That's the day when the Constitutional Convention was over, and the Constitution was there then to be ratified by the several states. And we're also going to talk about Boston's rich Christian history, because it is a very rich Christian history. It was a city set on a hill, and that was John Winthrop, who gave a sermon on the Bella before he landed in Boston. And part of that sermon is etched on Boston Common. So and we were also going to have our camp chaplain talk about the need for racial harmony and reconciliation and other issues like that. And it took a while for the city to get back to me. We were playing phone tag, and I finally got a call from the lady who was in charge of the permits, and she wasn't happy. She said, "You've been denied."
Mhm.
And she said, "I know this isn't over." I said, "Can I get an official letter or an email telling me why?" And I got an email that afternoon by the man who became the defendant in the case. And
Oh,
he said that it's a separation of church and state to fly this flag. Well, that's right then and there. I said, we got a case here. This is not true.
right.
The First Amendment doesn't even make mention of it. First Amendment says that Congress will not establish nor deny the free exercise thereof. And there was some concern by certain people in different states that there would be a federal church, because there are some states that had state churches at the time. Massachusetts had the Congregational Church. Connecticut, I think, had a state. I think even Pennsylvania did. Virginia, I believe, too. And when the First Amendment was ratified, that First Amendment had absolutely no bearing on, nothing to do with those state churches.
Mhm.
It was the states themselves that disestablished the churches. In some cases, years later, Massachusetts, it was until the early 1830s, I think, it was sort of left over from, England. And some of the stuff, we brought some good stuff, we brought some bad stuff, and one of them was state churches. And it took us a while to get rid of that. So I did an email blast to like a news release to the media. No local media, not one of them picked up on it. And a friend of mine who got the email says, get a hold of Liberty Counsel lc.org. And I was familiar with them. I didn't know anybody in the group, but I was familiar with the work. It's one of the maybe a dozen or so Christian-based pro bono legal groups that take cases like ours. So I emailed them that evening. I remember sitting on my chair with my laptop, and I went to their website and put down what was going on. The very next day, I get a call from attorney Richard Mast, who's based in Lynchburg, Virginia. He said, "We want to take your case." And wow, that was pretty quick. So we signed a contract, and they got busy with a demand letter saying that if they don't let us fly the flag, the Christian flag, that they'll sue. Now it was interesting. Boston has their own flag, as most cities have their own flag, and they also have a seal, as cities and towns do. In both the seal and the flag, there's a Bible verse from First Kings, and it's in Latin. Now I don't speak Latin fluently; not many people do, but I can catch a word here and there. But it says, um, may God watch over us as He did our forefathers."
Mm.
And that's from the Bible on the Boston flag and on the Boston seal. And in the email I received saying that's the separation of church and state, it was the seal, right, embedded in the email. I was all hypocritical. But the bottom line is that the city of Boston, by allowing us to do this, isn't establishing a religion. But that's what they're trying to. They said, "Oh, you can fly secular flags, or you can actually bring Christian flags with you, but you can't fly it on the flagpole." Well, you can't have a flag raising ceremony without raising a flag. Now, keep in mind that same city of Boston allowed the flag of Communist China, the flag of Communist Cuba, and in some cases, city officials participate in these ceremonies. And of course, the rainbow flag and the transgender flag was a relatively new flag back then, but they fly that. And they fly flags of even what we would consider friendly countries. There's Israeli organization flies the flag, and there's a Portuguese company, Portuguese organization, Portuguese American, Italian American flags. But our flag we couldn't fly. So the city was not going to relent, and so Liberty Counsel filed a lawsuit, and it was in July of 18. We had our first court appearance, and it's interesting. The lady was who the judge. She was an Obama appointee, so we knew right away that we probably wouldn't get any justice in her court. She was the same judge that's presided over the Whitey Bulger case. Whitey Bulger was a notorious gangster, mass murderer, and anyway, just she got some notoriety as a result of that. So then we went to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and we were denied there and then eventually to the Supreme Court. And Liberty Counsel did a great job. They had to come and do depositions and all that. It was just a lot. They're based in Florida. They must have made 8 or 9 trips to Boston. And it wasn't until, let's see, it was late September of 21, I'm sorry, in June of 21, they went to the Supreme Court. They actually delivered the case to the Supreme Court, writ of Satora, I think it's called. And it was very interesting that the young attorney who actually hand delivered that case, Jonathan Alexander, used to live 2 doors down as a little boy growing up. His dad was the pastor of senior pastor of a Haitian Baptist church. But we end up moving. It was my mother-in-law's home, and we end up moving there. And it was when I met with him, I said, "Where you from?" He says, "Well, I live in D.C., but I'm from Boston." "Whereabouts?" He said, "West Roxbury." What street?" He said, uh, uh, March Avenue. I said, "Oh my goodness, I remember you. You were a little guy. You used to come over when we had birthdays." And so
Oh.
what are the odds of that happening, you know? So the Supreme Court only takes about 1% of all the cases that they get every year, about 1%. But God doesn't worry about stats and figures and like that. If it was, and I said from the beginning, it was God's hand was in this the whole time. So they took the case, and it was September 30th. And what happens is that I think you need 3 justices to sign off on it. Now that doesn't mean you're gonna win your case. It means they will hear it.
Mhm.
And of course, how many cases are won or lost? I don't know that number. And it was a few days later, I get a call from one of the attorneys, and he said, "Hal, the city wants to settle. They'll say you can raise your flag, and they'll pay the legal fees." Now, it was all pro bono. We didn't pay any legal costs, win, lose, we wouldn't, or draw. This would have been really a loss because even though we would have got our flag and they would have paid legal costs, the case would have just disappeared. The case would have considered lost. Wasn't thinking about that at the time, but I said, no, I don't want to settle because this is much bigger than having a ceremony. I said,
Mm,
this could be a precedent. And Liberty Counsel takes cases based on three criteria. One, is the case winnable?
mhm.
Two, will it set a precedent? And three, is the client and their organization credible? I say, well, two out of three ain't bad. So, and I said to him also, I said, but went out any money, illegal fees. He said, don't worry. Gavin Newsom just sent us a very generous donation. I think they took the John MacArthur's church. I think they took that case and won. They were shut down over COVID and they won their case. So they had a couple of million, they got. So we had the Supreme Court heard the case or oral argument. It was January. It was right around that Martin Luther King was the Tuesday. So we went down there for a prayer vigil the night before, and then we had a rally the day of oral argument. We weren't. They still had COVID-19 protocols, so we weren't allowed to be in there. Just the attorneys. But it was very interesting. We were getting lots of media coverage from around the world, around the country, and ABC interviewed me, NBC, almost all of the networks. And believe it or not, we had about 19 amicus briefs, friend of the court, and on our behalf. One of them was from all places, the ACLU.
Mhm.
Now, almost always the ACLU is going to be on the other side, but for some reason, they were on our side. Uh, and the president of the ACLU had an op-ed in the Washington Post and I think the New York Times on our behalf, saying, "Hey, we don't agree with what they stand for." And also the Biden administration's Justice Department. I use the word Justice Department in quotation marks. Under the Biden administration, there wasn't a whole lot of justice going on. But we also had left-wing groups, let's see, separation of state and church, and they had some left-wing Jewish groups that went after us, a Sikh group. Uh, I think we had about 10 or 15 attorney generals on our behalf, and we had about 10 or so against us. And against us, it was including Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., and, the blue states, you would
Right.
think.
Mhm.
Uh, so during the oral argument, we were listening to it, and they don't broadcast as in, for television or video, but you can have an audio version while it's going on. And two of the attorneys that were sitting with us had big smiles on their faces. They said, even the liberal justices seem to be in our corner. Well, and they usually, after a case, they usually decide it a few days afterwards. They don't always release it though. But it was May 2nd. I get a call from one of our attorneys, and he said, "Hal, are you sitting down?" I said, "No." He said, "We won 9-0." So it was like a perfect game shutout, no hitter. And then after that, for like 2 days, my phone just rang off the hook. I got calls from there are people I haven't heard from, I haven't seen in 30 or 40 years reach out to me, and we got a lot of media coverage. I didn't think the city would actually allow us to have a flag raising ceremony, but part of the agreement would be that they would pay the Liberty Council $2.1 million in legal fees, and we would raise our flag. So it was early August, and all of the people that were going to speak at the one that we wanted to have they were still around. So we had a pastor friend of mine from the South Sudan, who gave a little talk about the blessings of liberty living in the United States. Reverend Kraft gave a talk on the need for racial harmony and what have you. And we had a historian friend of mine, Richard Howell, gave one on Boston's Christian. And these were short little rally speeches, and I spoke for a little bit, and we raised the flag, the Christian flag, and we had two of our campers, Willie Soon's sons. One played the violin, one played the bugle or the trumpet, and they raised the flag to "Amazing Grace."
Mhm.
And Ben Lane, who's a Christian recording artist, friend of ours, he was also on the keyboards. And we lowered the flag to "Battle Hymn of the Republic," sang by Jonathan Alexander, who was one of the attorneys. And he's also, I said, if you can't make it as a lawyer, you'd be a professional singer. Beautiful. And we closed with God Bless America. All that's on our YouTube channel. It was a great time. But what happened afterwards is that towns and cities all around the country stopped flying what they sometimes call as third party flags. And that includes rainbow flags. And I think there were some town officials that wanted to say no to rainbow flags, but were so afraid of the organized backlash that they just went along with it. Now they had a reason not to. Well, if we fly that flag, we're going to be sued. So, but back, I think it was 71, the Supreme Court had this terrible decision. There were a lot of bad decisions in the 70s, Roe v. Wade. This one was called Lemon v. Kurtzner. And Lemon was an atheist from Pennsylvania. He had a child in school, so he had standing. And it also affected the state of Rhode Island. So both Rhode Island and Pennsylvania were sending some funds to parochial schools for limited reasons. It wasn't to propagate the Catholic faith or anything like that. And that was a violation of, and the Supreme Court ruled of that separation of church and state. But something came out of that known as the Lemon Test, not the Lemon Law when you buy a junk automobile,
Mhm.
but the Lemon Test. And it got to the point where people would couldn't bring a Bible to school or into some public or government venue, or wear a cross or the crucifix, and even saying "God bless you" after you sneeze. Oh, that's a violation of the lemon decision. You can't do that. I even heard where the candy canes were being banned from schools because the candy cane's shaped like a J when you hold it the right way, this way, and it has a Christian allegory behind it.
Right.
So you see that, you're gonna, oh, you might become a Christian. So, oh, I'm gonna have that. And so all
I
that, and
wish it were that
there was
easy.
a, what's that?
I wish it were that easy.
Oh, I know it. There was another case. It was called the Kennedy case, Kennedy versus Bremerhaven School District in Washington State, I think, Washington State. And I got a chance to meet Coach Joe. He was an assistant coach, and in 2015, well, he was to pray after a game on the 50-yard line. Little short, little prayer. And as time went on, students would join him, football players, and sometimes on the other team. We got fired for that, and he won his case 6-3, and they cited our case. So between these two cases, the lemon test has been put to rest, and so it's okay to have a manger scene on government property. It's okay to have the Ten Commandments in school buildings. It's okay to bring a Bible, but a lot of people don't know this,
Right.
and we find out all. I get people from around the country reach out to me and say the problem is they're still relying on this lemon. They don't know about these cases, so you just have to appeal it. And in fact, Nashua, New Hampshire, there was a couple. They were raising flags in this in the town in the city, and they want to raise the flag that says with the pine tree flag. You might have seen the pine tree flag. And they said, "Oh no, that's white supremacy. That's a sign of white supremacy." Well, no, it was a sign of an event that happened in New Hampshire, the pine tree riot before the Revolutionary War, and it was a very significant event. And so they won their case recently, won their case, and they didn't have to go to the Supreme Court. The First District Court said, "Nah, Shurtleff v. Boston." They have to be able to let them fly their flag. So it was a real. I look at it was all a blessing for a blessing, and there's no way I could not let this in a way to teach the country a good lesson on the First Amendment. I think we accomplished that.
Absolutely. Yes, you really did. It was a great success. Congratulations and all of that.
No, thank you.
You spoke about a lot of things. You talked about like the ugly chapters in our history. You talked about the need for racial reckoning and some of the historical lies. So clearly you're not shy discussing race. So I wanted to ask you, as we approach the 250th anniversary, how can we teach a version of history that's both honest about its flaws, but also very and deeply appreciative of the founding ideals? And then what do you think is at stake in the conversation for how history should be taught, US history
Well,
specifically?
I think it's important when you look at history. There's a term called presentist or word presentist. That's somebody who judges the past by today's standards.
Mm,
And so if you were born in a country where slavery was legal, you say, well, it's legal. And doesn't mean it was right but
right.
it was legal. It was something that was accepted, not just in the United States, but around the whole world.
Yeah.
And if they had a better perspective, they would have known that it was both England. England played a major role in abolishing what is known as chattel slavery. I mean, the British Empire. The United States was second. The rest of the world really wasn't interested in it.
Mm.
Um, that incredible play movie, Amazing Grace, that tells the story of how it was abolished in England, and it took years to do it, and it finally happened. And once it happened, and then when the United States got involved too. In fact, our Constitution said the word slavery is not mentioned in the original Constitution. They used other term, peculiar institute. I can't remember if it was a peculiar institution or what have you. But when the Declaration of Independence was signed, every state was a slave state. But within a few years, half those states became free states. A lot of people don't realize that. It wasn't just the Civil War that ended slavery. Slavery was ended in many states long before that. Vermont came in as a free state. It was the 14th state, and the Northwest Ordinance said no slavery in any state that comes out of this. I think 5 states came out of it, no slavery. So there was a lot, even in the South, there were a lot of people who were against slavery, but it was a little more challenging. Again, now they say, well, George Washington, he owned slaves. Well, yes, he was born into a country, in the state of Virginia, where slavery was. He had over 400 slaves. What they don't tell you is that over 200 were elderly. They couldn't work. What was he going to do with 200 people who were, that couldn't work? You know, yeah, and so in some cases, freeing them, there are some states that passed laws that you can't emancipate. But I also think that people who grew up, once that declaration was signed and the struggle went on, I think many of these realized this is wrong. We really need to address this issue. Unfortunately, it took too long. It took over 70 years, and it cost, thousands of Americans that died in it. But and not only that, but other parts of the world they didn't even look at it as, especially the Muslim world. And a lot of people don't realize that it was the Muslims that introduced slavery to sub-Saharan Africa. And long before the Mid-Atlantic passage, which, by the way, 96% of the slaves from the Mid-Atlantic went to South America. You don't hear about that. You thought all come to the United States, mostly South America. And I don't know of any South American country where they're calling for reparations. I don't know any Muslim nations that are offering reparations. And what happened to the Muslims that they would castrate the men. So they don't have large black populations in these Muslim countries that where slavery was introduced. Also, Muslims couldn't convert. You can't enslave a fellow Muslim, so they never tried to convert their slaves. The United States, Christianity was introduced to the slaves. I mean, it was incredible. People like Stonewall Jackson. I had a friend who said, "Oh, these evil and wicked Confederates." I said, "Well, you better be careful when you get to heaven. You're going to bump into a lot of these evil and wicked Confederates because they're going to be in the presence of the Lord." What do you mean? Huh? I said, Stonewall Jackson. Oh, Stonewall Jackson. He and his first wife passed away. It was his sister-in-law. They ran a Sunday school for free slaves and blacks. They taught blacks how to read, violating Virginia law. And they taught them how to read so they could read the Bible. And to this very day, there's a church in Virginia. What town is it in? There's actually a stained glass window behind the pulpit honoring Stonewall Jackson. Can you believe that? It was a predominantly black church, all black church or predominantly black church. It was the son of the founder of the church's parents attended Stonewall Jackson Sunday School, and that obviously had a big impact in his life. And again, that church is it's in not West Virginia, but Western Virginia. I can't think of the name of the town offhand. I just did a little article about it too. So it really you really need to have a perspective on that. And I also recommend your viewers. There's a gentleman who's quite the historian. His name is Chad, middle initial O Jackson, and he does lots and lots of work on this issue. He's he's out of Texas, and he just does deep dives on this. He refutes some of the misinformation
Okay.
people like Howard Zinn promote. How evil the United States was and how wicked it is, what have you, and the fact that we're not on stolen land. That's another thing that they talk about, stolen land. Yeah, so it's there's a lot of misinformation, and I think all of us have felt. I remember Abeka. Abeka is a great homeschool program, right? And they come to the homeschool, your homeschool show. the Chaps Homeschool Convention. And one of the history books for junior high school, it mentioned that people thought the world was flat at the time of Columbus. And well, that wasn't the case. That's one of the misconceptions. And so I actually reached out to them. I don't know if they ever changed it. What they thought was the world, what Columbus thought the world was smaller. And he also was familiar with the scriptures, and he was familiar with Isaiah, and it said, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth."
Right.
So they knew the world was not flat.
Right.
They might have some people who believed it, but the average person didn't. I don't know if the average person thought a whole lot about the size of the earth when most of them didn't travel more than 20 or 30 miles in their lifetime, but navigators did. And so that was one of the misconceptions, as there are so many in
Yeah.
history now.
I
Yeah,
know
let me.
there's definitely a lot of misinformation. And I
Yeah.
can't believe we're already at time, but I do have another question for you. Um, if founding fathers were alive today, what do you think would concern them and what do you think might encourage them?
I think everything would concern them. The music, the culture, the noise. That's one thing. They said if they were in our time, the noise, and if we were back in their time, it would be the smell. That's the
Okay.
two things. I think what they would encourage them is the growth of the homeschool movement. I think that would encourage them, because that's pretty much how most of them were learned. They were homeschooled. I mean, there were schools, but most of them learned what they had to do at home, and I think that's what they would encourage them. And I also think the fact that we're still around using that same Constitution, and
Right.
still a lot of us still have reverence for that the incredible sacrifices. So I think those are the two things. But for the rest, I think they'd be very disappointed.
I can
Yeah, but
understand.
also they most of them were Christians,
Yes.
Trinitarian Christians. There was a few. Benjamin Franklin, who was called a deist, I don't believe he was, because at the convention, the Constitutional Convention, he asked for prayer and he said, if a sparrow can't fall to the earth without God's knowing it, a great nation can't rise up. A deist wouldn't say that, because a
Hmm.
deist believes that God set things up and kind of walked away. Okay, you're on your own.
Right.
So a deist wouldn't be calling for prayer, because when you pray, you're making a petition to a God who's in control, not a
Okay.
God that says, "Hey, I did my part. Catch you later, dudes." That's not the God we serve. And even Thomas Jefferson. Now, there's a great book that I recommend. It's written by John Eidsmoe, and he's a great friend of homeschooling. It's called Christianity and the Constitution. And he makes a case. He said that he, not Martin Luther, John Calvin. He said John Calvin was a founding father. He said, "Wait a minute now, John, you got a little." He was from France. He lived in Switzerland. Long. He said no. He said it's the worldview of the founders. Even those who may not have adhered to the Calvinist perspective, they
Mhm.
believed that man left up to his own devices was pretty wicked. The Bible confirms that. It says that our righteousness are as filthy rags. That's in Isaiah. That's without God in our lives. No matter what we do, it's not going to be pleasing to God. And he said the Constitution, when you read it, he said it had to be written by people with a Christian worldview. It couldn't have been written by anyone else. It couldn't be written by atheists, or Muslims, or Buddhists, or anyone else. And even though it's not full of Bible verses, there's a couple of references to God, but it called for checks and balances at all levels. And so that's when you read that, you say this had to have been written by people that had that worldview. You see it. Could you imagine a constitution written today? It'd be like 100,000 pages. Nobody would understand anything, and it would give unbridled power to the federal government
Yes,
and take away most of the rights of ours.
that's
But
right.
just look at how hostile some governments are towards homeschooling.
I know. It's really disappointing.
And of course, again, we had no trouble in Boston. That's because the schools are so rotten, they don't have time to mess with us. But a lot of times you go into a small town. Now we live in a conservative town here in New Hampshire. They wouldn't bother you. But there are some places where they have nothing, but they want to bother you. They want to take your kids away. And there are cases where, let's say there's a divorce or separation, and mom is taking the kids to a certain church and dad doesn't like it.
Mhm.
So dad will get the power of the state, say that church doesn't support so-called gay rights.
Mhm.
It's you can't go. And that's a case in Maine that's pending right now over something like that. So we see that, the heavy hand. In fact, I'm doing some presentations on Christian persecution around the world, but also in the United States. Now, we're not being beheaded for our faith right now in the United States, and I don't know if it ever will happen. But there's lots of persecution. People are fired for what they stand
Right.
for.
Hmm.
Jack, the guy who the bakery in Colorado, they're
Yes.
going after him.
Yeah.
He said, "Look, you can make a cake anywhere else. Just I have this respect. No, we're not going to do. We're going to go after you." Kim Davis, she's the lady in Kentucky that wouldn't issue a license to a couple of males that want to get. These guys really didn't want. They could have got a license from anyone else, but they went after her, and she stood firm. She stood her ground, and so that happens. And I think we have to stand our ground. We have no choice.
That's really a great challenge for our listeners because a lot of times we just think, oh, other powers are so powerful, we just have to kind of roll over and let it happen. But with your story, not just with what you've accomplished with Camp Constitution, but the victory that you had with being able to fly the flag and really set a precedent to say, no, it is not okay. And, our rights should not be terminated or messed with. I just think it's really awesome the work that you've done, and I really thank you for all that you had to share today, your wisdom, and all the work
Oh,
that you're doing
thank
in our
you.
community.
Yeah, one of my favorite verses, he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. And we're not called, and we can look at the world and be a little fearful. I mean, there's some bad things that are happening, but we don't have a spirit of fear. We have a spirit of courage.
Amen. Thank you so much.